If the only okay Adventures of George Man were a comic book series, then my powers would be a superhuman tolerance for capsaicin, not having the gene that makes cilantro taste like soap, and being immune to VR motion sickness.
I made that assumption after playing an hour and a half of Here They Lie on PSVR, a game that reviewed very poorly specifically because of it being a really good gag stimulator.
But I handled it fine. They were 90 uninterrupted minutes of me feeling mostly okay. I was only queasy for about 2 minutes after immediately taking the headset off, and that is apparently not normal. Friends I talked to about this game suddenly regarded me as some kind of mutant or someone with a really lame superpower, which really just makes me want to know how many players of VR games are susceptible to motion sickness and what makes me that different from them.
As it turns out, researchers and developers don't have an easy answer to either question. A variety of results have been reported for a variety of prevention methods. So you actually might know a whole lot more than many other people about how many players might be feeling motion sickness with VR games. Do we have a percentile of that demographic?
Well, I mean, that data I've never done research on myself, but I attended a talk at last PAX by, well, let me look it up as we're talking. One of the guys there was from, I think it was Oculus, but I'll confirm that. And he actually gave hard numbers from them from their research. And I think it was 40%, but I'll confirm that looking it up.
That was Jeffrey Zatkin, developer at Experiment 7 Games, where they make VR games about sitting in fancy rooms and playing fancy board games with your friends. But the 40% figure he cited supposedly comes from Asa Reed, a developer from Unity who gave the figure at a PAX Dev Talk. But without the talk published online, it's hard to source that 40% figure directly from Reed himself, and it seems only more unreliable when you compare it to other developer studies like this Columbia University experiment that found that out of 30 participants, 80% of them experienced VR sickness symptoms. Among the studies that have been published, a lot of them use pretty small sample sizes and get pretty different results. For example, here's Michael Abrash of Oculus claiming that only 20% of us are immune.
So a very rough thing, which I would not say is scientific in the sense there's been a controlled study, but I would say 20% of the population doesn't get motion sick. 20% of the population gets motion sick and always gets motion sick. And maybe 60% of the population gets good over time. But you know, it's really very idiosyncratic, and that's very rough. Some people definitely get better over time with exposure. Most people.
So depending on who you ask, I'm either in a 20% minority or a scant 60% majority, and those numbers are totally subject to change depending on the control methods and visual motion sickness prevention methods each game uses. For games that have a stationary cockpit in play, or games that use the full body room scale motion controls kinds of setups, you're more likely to see something like 0% of users experience motion sickness. Because there's a huge, inconvenient truth behind this problem, and that is that the typical FPS workhorse genre of action video games causes pretty bad motion sickness once you translate it into VR.
Which is evident as soon as you play a game like Here They Lie on PSVR, which inundates players with all sorts of jury-rigged tricks for reducing motion sickness. Like interval turning. Turn the right stick and the game fades to black as your view rotates about 15, 20 or so degrees to the right or the left. If you go into the options to turn that off, you still have to put up with a very visible, obvious FOV limiter that tunnels the outline of your vision black when you turn the stick. In either way, when it loads up a new map after a long bit of playing, it tells you to take off the headset and take a break. All of which only served to annoy me because, admittedly at the time, I thought I was above all that. That interval turning is known in the industry as snap turning, and it was popularized by Cloudhead Games as the gallery. The tunnel vision that shrinks your field of view into a circular vignette comes from a Columbia Engineering School study that found that it was an effective method for preventing VR sickness. And stopping the game to ask the user to take a break, that is straight from Oculus's Best Practices Guide on Preventing Simulator Sickness. Probably the only trick this game doesn't use is the nasum virtualis, a static nose mesh that attempts a fixed reference point similar to having a cockpit on the screen. A study at Purdue University found that this helped players, but only for a few seconds.
But, I mean, if you're me, a virtual nose stamped in the middle of the frame would only serve to make VR gaming more immersive. So when I tweeted out a request for help researching this issue, I got a lot of responses, including one from John Carmack himself, who quickly aimed the blame on a sensory mismatch between what your eyes are seeing and what your body is feeling, specifically the organs in your inner ear.
Far behind the part of your ear that hears things is the part of your ear that feels things. These tubes of liquid in your inner ear slosh around as your body moves, and though you don't feel that liquid moving around, your brain does. This is the vestibulary system that Carmack was referring to, and its convenient location right next to the brain means that messages from your vestibular system are oftentimes the first and most expected signals telling your brain that body movement is happening.
So if there's that sensory mismatch, if two very important parts of your body are experiencing very clearly contradictory signals, your brain will think it's hallucinating because you're poisoned. Even though you're not. Your brain will try to make you vomit out all that imaginary poison because you must be hallucinating. So if you're inside of a boat in a room with no windows, your ears are feeling the motion of the boat, but your eyes are not seeing it, which is the same deal if you're in a car looking down below the windows trying to read a book or look at a screen, which is a horribly nauseating activity whose symptoms I never did outgrow. And in both of those cases, you're feeling motion but not seeing it, whereas with VR games, your eyes are seeing motion but your ears are not feeling it, which means that even though it reaches the same conclusion, VR sickness is actually the exact opposite process of traditional regular motion sickness.
So, do you think motion sickness in that case might be kind of a misnomer? Should we be calling it something else like VR sickness or simulator sickness?
It's hard to know. I mean, a common nomenclature hasn't really been figured out, but VR sickness or virtual reality sickness, it is similar to motion sickness. But there's a couple of things, some of it is technical, some of it's not having a high enough frame rate, some of it's having the animations not matching, the visual perception of your eye. Those things can also cause it. Because again, presence, your brain actually, after a little bit of time, thinks you're there.
This may be why I've seen a lot of players reporting sickness even in cockpit racing games like Dirt Rally and Project Cars that have you driving over bumpy terrain. Because even though you're sitting down in real life like the guy in a cockpit, if the horizon line is rotating to the left and right as that car jiggles, the fluids of your inner ear will not be jiggling about.
And for God's sake, keep the horizon level. That's the shortcut to Puke Town, is to tip and tilt the horizon irrespective of reality.
So hearing that inner ear sensitivity was the issue gave me a really stupid idea. Now, since I'm a revolting slob, I've never really been super diligent about ear hygiene. I mean, I wipe them down with the swab every week, but I've never really gotten deep down in there with a fizzy peroxide solution and really made sure it was wiped clean and dry from the inside until I wanted to test if that would make my susceptibility to VR motion sickness any different.
So after completely fizzing up, draining out, and wiping out the inside of my ears, I called up my friend Matt and played a few hours of Oculus Rift games. And just as before, games that use control schemes with a more accurate sense of presence didn't cause any sickness. Sitting in a cockpit in Project Cars caused no problems. The full-body room-scale motion controls of Superhot were just a damn good old time.
Oh! Punches! Yeah! Oh my god. Video games are super cool.
It's supposed to be analog stick locomotion movement that's the culprit, right? But I spent 20 going on 30 minutes playing Onward, a game with analog stick locomotion that didn't give me any negative reactions either.
Where are you at?
The first and so far only time I've ever genuinely felt sick playing a VR game happened 20 minutes into a session of Minecraft.
Oh, puke bucket! Right.
Wait, this is a salad.
it's what I had.
And finding out that this could happen to me and knowing that I wasn't immune was a humbling experience.
Breathe it in.
Partly because a couple experts shot down my grand idea about ear hygiene. It turns out your inner ear is so deep down inside there that it doesn't really matter how much wax builds up on the outside.
But it also got me thinking back to when I was playing Here They Lie, and Now I'm entertaining the thought that maybe the reason I handled that game so well is because all the annoying little visual tricks they were implementing were actually working as intended. And then I thought more on the sample of games I have been playing in VR, and right now I think the culprit isn't ear hygiene. I think it's just how Minecraft handles speed, motion, and acceleration compared to the other games.
Because in Minecraft, you're always hovering along at what would be a normal human's brisk sprint as soon as you press any movement button. And though I felt discomfort from the start, it was specifically pressing the sprint button, which really kicks you into a 25 to 30 mile per hour scooter ride, that turned me straight green. Combine that with the judder of distant terrain chunks loading in as you sprint forwards, and all of that breaks quite a few of Oculus's motion sickness commandments. Don't accelerate your player to fast speeds, don't let the game stutter with a bunch of latency or lag, and don't move the camera in ways not initiated by the user, which is what it felt like when I was struggling to figure out which direction the game decided the forward button was going to send me towards. But most of all, it was speed and acceleration that drew that clear line between the locomotion system of Minecraft versus other games that I have handled very well. Because Here They Lie, RE7, and Onward all move much, much slower when you push that stick, which is something that, for some reason, I'm apparently able to tolerate faster than most people. I'd really like to know why I'm different, but maybe that's just gonna stay a mystery. Do you think there might be some kind of demographic information explaining why I was immune to some of those experiences versus others, or
I think it's physiological. I mean,
is that all just speculative and up in the air at this point?
My sister doesn't get seasick. I do. We have almost the same biology. We both have the same parents. We're similar age, similar environments, but people are just different.
There's a lot of ambiguity here. Different methods of locomotion can cause different kinds of sicknesses depending on the use of different countermeasures between different users, and what I think is really the biggest hole in all of that is that we don't have a solid, conclusive, agreed-upon consensus of the number of how many players are even expected to be susceptible to it. Which seems like it should be one of the most egregious examples of video game secrecy yet. I mean, this is data that could affect people's health, but whether it's 40% or 60% or 80% of users that experience this motion sickness, companies don't seem to want to be releasing those numbers, because unless that number is infinitesimally small, it's not gonna look good to confirm that their product makes people sick. But there is a silver lining to it. There is a conclusive, agreed-upon consensus between a lot of different companies that simple experience and exposure and practice with VR will help people susceptible to VR sickness become more comfortable with VR.
The more experience users have with the virtual environment, the less likely they are to experience simulator sickness. With a bit of training, most people can get used to seasickness or altitude sickness, so why not simulator sickness? I think this is why Resident Evil 7 is such a big deal, and why it's been fairly openly accepted as the first big killer app to sell VR games. After a couple years of developers insisting locomotion had to be done via teleporters, or swooping between preset waypoints, or happening only inside of a vehicle's cockpit, we have a big AAA FPS game entirely playable in VR via the traditional methods. And people are reviewing it very, very positively. I think the biggest three things that helped that happen were, number one, people have gotten used to VR. RE7 may be the very first game a lot of new customers play, and for them they may have a hard time adjusting, but the Rift has been around for a few years, and the Vive and the PSVR launched about 6 months ago. The original DK1 of the Oculus Rift is almost 4 years old after all. Number two, the game's got pages of options, which is really unique for a console game. Depending on how your body reacts to the locomotion in this game, you can turn the interval turning or FOV limiters off, or even go into the specifics of things like what movement transition animations play, how fast they play them, and how wide the intervals of your snap turning will be. It's a lot of very specific options that can very specifically hone in on a user's individual tolerance for motion sickness. Number three is that the game happens to be designed in a way that's nicely compatible with VR anyways. which may be intentional. Given the marketing push they've made with PSVR associating with RE7, it's likely that that was quite intentional by design. Your character moves very, very slowly. You don't have a lot of fast, jerky motions accelerating your perceived body's position out of your real body's comfort zone. Big, chunky gun models give the player a static visual reference. The maps are small and claustrophobic enough to both keep your sense of direction and to keep frame rates high. And another happy little accident is your flashlight. This narrow cone of light naturally emulates the effects of Purdue's artificial FOV limiting silhouetting.
So, between my own experiences learning how motion sickness works and how some games are addressing it and how well some of them are doing it, I think we're at the cusp of developers figuring out software-based design solution standards that can fix this problem without really limiting the amount of mobility the player is going to have compared to traditional game genres. I think what we're going to see are more VR games like RE7 that, instead of choosing a wacky new movement method, just choose instead to strike a balance between speed, acceleration, and visibility that makes them fully playable and enjoyable both in VR and out of VR.
Is there really a easy solution for motion sickness right now?
Yeah. I mean, it's just going to be what you let people do and the kinds of things you make.
Can you clarify on that?
Sure. I think in the same way, let me give a somewhat twisted analogy. You would not build Call of Duty on an iPad or an iPhone in the way that you do on a PlayStation or an Xbox or a PC. It would be silly. The controls are different, the hardware is different, the screen is different, the player expectation is different, the amount of time you spend is different. You know, it's really hard to get the fidelity, even just going for the controls. The fidelity level of controls on a touchpad is just different than it is on a console or a PC. So you wouldn't build the exact same game. You would build a different game adapted to that hardware if you wanted to do it. In the same way, VR is a whole different set of hardware. You're going to build games differently. You're going to build a different game on a browser than on a touchpad, than on a console or a PC. You're going to build games differently in VR.